She thought she knew the man she loved, until one moment changed everything. In a life that looked perfect on the surface, cracks began to form. Small at first, almost invisible. But behind the smiles were secrets, behind the promises were lies, and behind the love was betrayal waiting to be revealed. When the truth finally comes crashing down, it doesn't just break her heart, it ignites something stronger. Because this time, she won't be the victim. She'll be the one who takes control, who rises from the ruins, and who proves that losing everything can be the beginning of becoming unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes the truth hurts, but it also sets you free. The people who betray you don't define you. How you rise after does. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about refusing to stay down. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support means everything and helps us create more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
At 8 months pregnant, her husband asked her to stay in the spare room. It wasn't for a medical reason or because they were renovating. It was because his mistress, who was also his chief of staff, needed the master suite to prep for a business summit. And it got worse. The mistress had the nursery dismantled. She had movers haul away the custom-built crib and replace the architectural models Elara, a former architect, had made for their son with generic corporate art. She called the pregnant wife a beautiful distraction, who was lucky Art was so understanding. And the husband, the tech CEO who built a $90 million startup from code and charisma, said nothing. Every time he chose his ambition. What he didn't know, what his mistress didn't know, was that the quiet woman they were pushing aside, the wife they called sweet but simple, was the sole heir to the $300 billion Beaumont global conglomerate. She had concealed her identity for 3 years, craving a love that valued her spirit, not her stock portfolio. She had her answer now, and what she did next would change everything. The lesson in this story is profound. It's a truth many discover when it's far too late. Never judge a person's power by their volume. The most unassuming person in the room is often the one who owns it, and the individual you marginalize today might be the one holding your future in their hands tomorrow. Real love isn't about choosing what's easy. It's about choosing what's right with courage every single time. If this story resonated with you, if it brought to mind your own hidden strength or someone you know who is being undervalued, please leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been completely misjudged by the very people who were supposed to see you clearly? I read every one. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We share stories of resilience, of justice, of men and women who refuse to be made small. Share this with someone who needs the reminder today. You can work from the guest suite for a few days. My chief of staff needs the space, Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the laptop glowing on his lap. The cool light sharpened the lines of his face, and for a heartbeat, Elara was sure she'd heard him wrong. She stood in the archway of their home office, a hand resting on the swell of her belly. 7 months. The baby gave a sudden sharp kick, as if he understood a truth his mother was still trying to absorb. "What was that?" Elara asked. "Corinne is flying in tomorrow," Arthur said, his fingers still flying across the keyboard. "She's running point on the investor summit here. She needs the master suite as a command center. The guest room is perfectly comfortable for you. Is just until the deal closes." Just until the deal closes. The phrase felt like a small, hard pebble in her throat. Elara had just spent the last month personally overseeing the installation of the nursery 2 doors down, custom soundproofing, a hospital-grade air filtration system, and a hand-carved crib from Sweden. She wanted her son to have a sanctuary. "Arthur, I'm 7 months pregnant," she said, her voice even. She had learned to keep it even. "I need our bed. The mattress has the right support. My doctor specifically said, Elara." He finally looked at her. His face wore the expression he used in meetings when an employee raised an obstacle he found trivial. It was a look of strained patience. "She is my chief of staff. This is a billion-dollar deal. Don't make things complicated." Don't make things complicated. As if her body, her health, and the tiny human she was building were mere complications on his path to success. She opened her mouth, then shut it. "Okay," she finally whispered. She walked down the long, sterile hallway to the guest suite. The door handle was loose. The mattress was a firm, unforgiving queen. The sheets smelled of the generic, scent-free detergent the cleaning service used, not the soft lavender she preferred. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, and the unfamiliar frame groaned under her weight. She placed both hands over her belly. "It's all right," she whispered to her son. "We're all right." But her hands were trembling, not from the discomfort, but from what it signified. She was sixth on his list of priorities. After the deal, after the company, after his image, after his ambition, and after Corinne. She was sixth. Their son was seventh. She leaned her head against the generic hotel art hanging above the bed and stared at the opposite wall. A tiny crack snaked down the plaster, a miniature river delta no one had bothered to fix. She breathed in for a count of 4, held, and exhaled for a count of 6. It was a calming technique her obstetrician had taught her, a way to manage stress, a way to count breaths instead of screaming what she was really thinking. In the master suite down the hall, Arthur's phone chimed with a text. His reply was quick. The words were a low murmur, but they carried through the walls. "It's handled. She's fine with it. You know, Elara, she's easy." Easy? She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes until she saw stars. She was easy. The next morning, Elara woke at 5, her back screaming from the unyielding mattress. She padded to the kitchen, started the espresso machine, and laid out the ingredients for the green smoothie Arthur liked. She had learned this his first month at the new startup. She had learned 1,000 tiny preferences. She was still waiting for him to learn a single one of hers. At 8 o'clock, she walked down the hall to check on the nursery. She wanted to admire the way the morning light hit the mobile of tiny, hand-blown glass planets. She opened the door. The crib was gone. The rocking chair was gone. The changing table was gone. In the center of the room sat a sterile white lacquer conference table and 4 chrome chairs. On the table, a note in the sharp, elegant handwriting she knew belonged to Corinne. "Needed a breakout room for the summit. Moved the baby stuff to the basement storage unit. This space has a much better energy for closing deals." See? Elara read the note 3 times. She folded it into a perfect tiny square and placed it back on the table. She stood motionless. The air filtration system hummed quietly, scrubbing the air for a baby who no longer had a room. The morning light still caught the planets, but now they spun over an empty, sterile space. She closed the door without a sound. She was not a woman who slammed doors. Lately, she had begun to wonder if that was the entire problem. Corinne arrived at 10. She entered the penthouse like a conquering general, her movements sharp and efficient. She wore a tailored black suit and an expression of grim purpose. She smelled of ambition and a perfume called success. "Elara," Corinne said, her greeting clipped. She didn't offer a hug. Her eyes scanned Elara from head to toe, lingering for a moment on her swollen belly. "You look exhausted. Remember, stress isn't good for the baby." "Hello, Corinne," Elara replied. "How was the flight?" "Productive. The market in Tokyo is ripe, but they need reassurance." She swept past Elara and into the living room, pulling out a tablet. "I've had all new floral arrangements delivered. White orchids, minimalist. It reads better for the Japanese investors." She looked at the vibrant bouquet of peonies Elara had arranged that morning. "Those are a little sentimental." Arthur came out of the office. He greeted Corinne with a hug, a professional one, but one that lasted a second too long. Corinne smiled, a flash of warmth reserved only for him. "Arthur," she said, her hand on his arm, "you look tired. Are you eating?" "I'm fine, C, ready to win." "Ooh, you need to be at 100%. I'll order in a proper dinner tonight. You can take it easy," she said, glancing at Elara. "You look like you need the rest." That evening, they ate sushi from a high-end restaurant out of black plastic containers. Corinne had ordered for them. She served Arthur first, then herself. As an afterthought, she pushed a container toward Ilara. "Have you decided on a name?" Corinne asked, picking at a piece of toro. "We're leaning toward Antoine," Ilara said softly, "after my grandfather." "Antoine Vance," Corinne said, tasting the name. "It's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? We need something with more brand recognition, something strong, like Blade or Jet." She said it with a little laugh, a laugh that implied Ilara's choice was hopelessly naive. Ilara looked at Arthur, waiting. He was carefully dabbing a piece of tuna in soy sauce. He said nothing. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 5 seconds isn't long unless you're waiting for the man who promised to love you to defend you and your unborn child. Then it's a lifetime. Ilara placed her chopsticks down. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm not feeling well." She walked to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet lid. She pressed her forehead against the cool, tiled wall. She did not weep. She would not allow herself to weep. Not yet. It wasn't about the name. It was about the 5 seconds. She smelled jasmine the moment she returned. Corinne had lit a scented candle on the console table. "Jasmine," she announced. "It promotes clarity and focus." She was curating the very air in their home, erasing every trace of Ilara's scent, her presence. Ilara sat back down. Her sushi was untouched. She didn't look at it. Over the next 3 days, Corinne's occupation of their home was complete. She had the caterers rearrange the pantry. She briefed the cleaning staff with a new, more rigorous schedule. She replaced their family photos on the digital frame with a rotating slideshow of Arthur's company logo and press clippings. And she talked. She talked constantly about Arthur's genius, his vision, the other women he had dated. "That venture capitalist from Stanford was brilliant," Corinne mused on the second night. "Victoria Dent. Her father practically owns Sand Hill Road. A real power couple. But Arthur chose you," she added, her tone making it sound like a charming but illogical act of charity. Ilara cleared the empty containers. That night, lying on the rigid guest bed, Ilara thought about the woman she had been before all this. The woman who built things. The woman who owned rooms, not just existed in them. She remembered the woman she was before Julian, before the sleek Chicago condo, before the life that had meticulously contracted around her until it felt 2 sizes too small. She met him in a shared workspace downtown, November sleet streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was sketching on a tablet, drinking tea from a thermos, dressed in an old university sweatshirt and leggings. No assistant, no driver, no hint of the last name that unlocked boardrooms and sent stock prices soaring. He'd slid into the seat opposite hers, the place buzzing with startup energy, and asked what she was designing. She'd shown him the wireframe. He said he admired her focus. She said she was a freelance UX designer, which was technically true. She designed user experiences just for an $80 billion global tech conglomerate. She omitted the part where her father had coded the first line of its foundational AI, the part where she held a controlling interest, and the part where her personal investments could acquire his entire boutique firm 50 times over and not even cause a ripple. Their first dinner was at a crowded Italian place. He spoke for an hour straight about his fund, his strategy, his relentless drive. He had $75 million in assets under management, a point of immense pride. He'd scraped it all together himself. No trust fund, no silver spoon, just grit and a hunger to win. She found his ambition charming back then. He had made $75 million, and it formed the core of his being. She had been born into $80 billion and had dedicated her adult life to making sure no one knew it. He never asked which client she worked for. He never pried about her family. He never searched her name online. In those first months, she mistook his lack of curiosity for respect for her privacy. Only later did she see it for what it was, a deep-seated narcissism. He wasn't interested in her past because he was utterly consumed by his own ascent. They were married within a year, an intimate ceremony at the city's botanical gardens with 40 guests. Chloe's side was conspicuously small. Her father, Arthur, was there, looking slightly bewildered by the small scale of it all. Her brother, Leo, flew in from London, pulled her aside, and whispered, "Are you certain about this, Chloe?" She was certain. She was breathtakingly, foolishly certain, in the way only a person who has never truly been broken can be. Julian's mistress, Isabella, was at the wedding. A business associate, he'd said. She surveyed the orchids with a predatory little smile. "It's very quaint," she'd remarked to Chloe, who had paid for the entire event from a fund she'd told Julian was a small payout from a previous job. The small payout was a $50 million dividend from her stock options. Now, curled up on the chaise lounge in her home office, she replayed their beginning. Julian holding doors, Julian sending tulips, Julian calling her his anchor in a voice that made her feel safe and seen. Every memory was now poisoned, not because it was a lie, but because she finally understood the subtext. He loved her when she fit neatly into his world, when she was accommodating, when she was simple. The word echoed in her mind, simple. Down the hall, she could hear Julian's voice from his office. He was on the phone laughing. "No, she's great. A bit naive, but sweet. She'll be a wonderful mother." Chloe laid a hand on her stomach. The baby turned, a slow, powerful roll under her ribs. "I hear him," Chloe thought. "I hear him too." The next morning, Julian announced he had a surprise. "Isabella is connecting us with her obstetrician. Apparently, he's the best in the Midwest, handles all the high-profile births." "She called him for us," Julian said, beaming. "He's squeezing you in for a consultation." "I have a doctor," Chloe said calmly. "Dr. Anya Sharma. We've been seeing her since I was 8 weeks pregnant." "Honey," Julian said, the word a silken trap. "I'm sure she's fine, but this is Isabella's personal doctor. This is the best. Our kid deserves the best, right?" He was already looking at his phone, scrolling through market updates. "I like my doctor," Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm. "She knows my file. My iron levels have been a bit—" "They can get the file," Julian dismissed, not looking up. "Isabella already said she'd handle the transfer." "She already said," Chloe repeated, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "I'm just trying to help, Chloe. It's a great connection for us." "You're trying to let your colleague manage my pregnancy." The condo fell silent. Julian put his phone down, his expression hardening. The scent of coffee from the machine suddenly seemed overwhelming. "Chloe," he said, and it was his warning tone, the one that meant, "Don't be difficult, asterisk." "Isabella is doing us a huge favor. Just say you'll go. It's one appointment. Say thank you. Say thank you to the woman he was sleeping with, the woman who was now inserting herself into the most intimate part of her life, choosing the person who would deliver her child." Chloe looked at her husband, really looked at him. She scanned his face for a trace of the man she thought she knew, for any sign that he recognized her as a separate person with her own thoughts, her own agency. There was nothing. His eyes were just impatient, waiting for her to play her part, the easy wife, the grateful, simple woman. "Okay," Chloe heard herself say. The word felt like swallowing sand. Later, in the nursery, she sat on the floor and looked at her own hands. They were strong hands, capable, hands that had approved billion-dollar acquisitions, hands that had held her father's when her mother passed away, hands that had assembled every single piece of furniture in this room. She pressed them against her swollen belly. Her son kicked, a sharp, insistent jab. "I'm not small," she whispered to him. "He just needs me to be." She stated it as a fact, because it was. The discovery didn't happen with a phone call. It happened with a piece of technology. Julian was in the shower. His gym bag was unzipped on the floor, and a sleek, unfamiliar phone had slipped out from a side pocket. It wasn't his usual work phone or personal device. It was a burner, a ghost. She picked it up. He was so confident in his world, so sure of her lack of sophistication, that he'd only used a simple 6-digit passcode, a child's lock. Her fingers flew across the screen, running a diagnostic shortcut from muscle memory. 30 seconds. That's all it took to bypass the lock screen. Her company had developed the exploit 3 years ago. The texts were from Isabella, hundreds of them, pictures, jokes about a deal they were closing, and then the thread that shattered everything. "She has no idea, does she?" Isabella had written. "None," Julian replied. "Thinks I'm a god for pulling in 10 million on the Henderson deal. It's almost cute. And after the baby comes, she'll be busy, happy to play house. It's better this way. She's not built for this world. You need a partner, Jay, not a project." "I have one," he'd written back. Chloe sank to the floor, the phone clattering beside her. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the condescension, the utter dismissal of who she was. She didn't cry. The feeling was colder, sharper than tears. It was rage, pure, clarifying rage. She picked up her own phone and dialed. Ava answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and alert. "It's about damn time," Ava said. "I was about to send a wellness check. What did he do?" "He thinks I'm simple," Chloe said, her voice low and steady. There was a pause. "He thinks..." "What?" "He called me his project, said I wasn't built for his world." Silence. Then Ava's voice, devoid of any sympathy, full of steel. "Chloe, tell me you're done. Say the word and I'll have his firm delisted by lunch." A laugh escaped Chloe's throat, a harsh, rusty sound she didn't recognize. Then came the sob, a single, violent shudder that ripped up from her core. Ava didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say it would be okay. She just waited, a silent presence on the other end of the line. When Chloe could breathe again, Ava spoke. "Tell me everything." So Chloe told her. The second phone, the obstetrician, Isabella at the wedding, the constant, subtle campaign to shrink her world down to a manageable size. Ava, the COO of her family's empire, listened without saying a word. This was Ava's way. "You know what I'm going to say," Ava said when she finished. "Don't." You built a dollhouse, Chloe, and you got mad when he started treating you like a doll. You're sitting in a multi-million-dollar condo, pregnant and heartbroken over a man who thinks 75 million is a big deal. That's not fair, isn't it? You wanted him to feel like a giant, so you pretended to be a pygmy. He's not a giant, Chloe. He's a man who got lucky in a bull market. Chloe wiped her eyes on her sleeve. The city lights glittered outside, a galaxy she owned a part of. For a moment, she felt like she was seeing it clearly for the first time in years. Ava was more than her best friend. She was the keeper of Chloe's other life. They'd been roommates at Stanford. Ava was the only one who knew the full scope of the Calloway legacy, and the only one who had begged Chloe not to throw it away for a fantasy. "You told me you wanted to be wanted for yourself," Ava said gently. "Not for your name, not for your stock portfolio. Just you." "I remember," Chloe whispered. "Did he ever want you, Chloe? The real you?" The question echoed in the silent room, across the 500 miles of fiber optic cables separating them. The truth was brutally simple. "He wanted the version of me he could understand," Chloe said. "The easy version, the one that made him feel bigger." "That's not love," Ava said. "That's ego fuel." After they hung up, Chloe stood by the window for a long time, watching the endless stream of headlights on the freeway below. She remembered being 25, fresh out of her master's program. Her father had assumed she'd take her seat on the board. Leo was already heading up acquisitions. The path was laid out for her, a corner office with a view, a life of insulated power. But she had seen what that life did. She watched her father grow distant, consumed by the machine he'd built. She watched Leo become suspicious, weighing every new acquaintance for their potential angle. Every friendship was a networking opportunity. Every romance was a potential merger. Chloe wanted none of it. She wanted to meet someone in a noisy, anonymous space and be seen for nothing more than her smile. She wanted a child who would learn to ride a bike in a public park, not on a manicured estate. So she ran. She moved to Chicago, took a small apartment, and built a cover story that was plausible and plain. She told people her family was in software. She said her father was semi-retired. She lived on a fraction of her dividend income, an amount that would have made her father's wealth managers weep. And for a while, it had worked. Julian loved her, or rather, he loved the story she told. The difference between the two had taken 3 years to surface, and now it was the only thing she could see. She walked out of the nursery, picked up the burner phone, and placed it on the kitchen counter, right where he would see it. The screen was on, open to the text messages. Then she went to her office, opened her laptop, and for the first time in years, logged into the Callaway family's secure server. Beside a marina filled with sleek sailboats, she sat on a bench and watched a man her age lifting a laughing toddler into the air. The child shrieked with delight. The man's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, smiled, and called to his wife on the boat. "Maya made reservations, can you believe it?" Eliza's heart clenched. She couldn't believe it. She truly couldn't. The baby kicked, 3 soft thumps like a secret knock. "I feel you," Eliza whispered. "I feel you." That night, she returned to their waterfront condo to pick up a book. Julian was in his study, his voice coming through the door, smooth, charming, the voice that had once made her feel anchored. His tablet lay on the kitchen island, the screen still glowing. A shared photo album was open, one he'd set up for them. An image from the previous night was at the top, uploaded from his watch. Subject: celebrations. Julian was clinking champagne flutes with a woman whose face was turned away, but Eliza recognized the signature onyx ring of Serafina Vance, the city's most ruthless food critic. A caption beneath it read, "To our venture." Eliza knew she was supposed to be at a supplier dinner. She read it again, and a third time. Each word chipped away at the beautiful fantasy they were living. The venture. The one he'd never mentioned because he'd never considered her a partner. He had assumed, with the absolute certainty of a man who never had to doubt himself, that Eliza Hayes had nothing left to offer. No ambition, no capital, no connections. He had married her believing she was a tech prodigy who had cashed out and retired. A brilliant woman happy to be his brilliant wife. And his business partner had encouraged him to make sure she remained a beautiful, passive part of his brand. Eliza closed the tablet. She placed her hands flat on the cool marble countertop. She stood perfectly still. The wine fridge hummed. A foghorn sounded low in the distance. The jasmine diffuser puffed out its cloying sweet scent. She thought about the investment fund, worth over $300 million. She thought about the block of shares in cutting-edge AI companies she held. She thought about the advisory board she sat on, taking calls from a spare bedroom while Julian and Eleanor held strategy meetings downstairs. They thought she was a footnote. They built their plans around her as if she were a piece of art, expensive, decorative, and easily replaced. The baby delivered one solid kick directly into her palm. "I know," Eliza whispered. "We are not a footnote." The invitation had been stuck to the refrigerator for weeks. The Seattle Gastronomy Awards, the biggest night in the city's culinary scene. Black tie, 500 guests, an event where fortunes were made and reputations were shattered, and wives were expected to clap enthusiastically for their husbands. 2 days before, Eleanor, Julian's partner, had brought a dress to the condo. It was a dark, shapeless silk caftan. "We need the focus to be on Julian's brand," Eleanor had said, smoothing the fabric. "This is chic, but subtle. It won't draw attention to your condition." "My condition," Eliza repeated, her voice flat. "Pregnancy is a miracle, of course, but on a night like this, image is everything." Eliza looked at the dress. It was a shroud, a designer shroud, but a shroud nonetheless. "Thank you, Eleanor. I'll consider it." She did not consider it. The night of the awards, Eliza put on her own dress. Emerald green, silk, impeccably tailored. It didn't hide her belly. It framed it. 7 months of a new life, a bold, beautiful curve. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in months, she saw the woman who had built an empire from a dorm room. When she walked into the living room, Eleanor was waiting by the door. Her face cycled through 3 distinct emotions in less than 2 seconds. Shock, then fury, then cold assessment. "You're wearing that," Eleanor stated. It was not a question. "I am," Eliza replied. Julian appeared from the hallway. He looked at Eliza, and a light flickered in his eyes. She thought it might be pride, but it was extinguished by a nervous glance at Eleanor. Always a glance at Eleanor. "You look amazing, Eli," he said, his voice strained. "She'll be the center of attention," Eleanor said, her voice clipped. She grabbed her clutch and swept out of the condo. The awards were held in a renovated warehouse on the waterfront, all exposed brick and soaring glass ceilings. A jazz trio played somewhere in the background. Julian moved through the crowd with practiced ease, a firm handshake for the men, a charming smile for the women. The celebrity chef at the top of his game. Eleanor moved differently, like a shark, steering Julian from one investor to the next. She introduced Eliza as Julian's wife. The title was a cage. She was the brand. Eliza was the brand's companion. The silent auction tables were laden with Michelin-star dinner packages, Napa wine tours, and a custom Italian sports car. Eliza stood near the oyster bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water, observing. She had always been good at observing. It's how you find the flaws in a system. Then she heard it. Eleanor's voice, pitched to be overheard. "Eliza doesn't really follow the industry. Her world was tech, much more straightforward, but we're getting her up to speed." A ripple of condescending laughter from the small group of investors. They glanced over at Eliza, a mix of pity and polite disinterest on their faces. They saw the pregnant wife, out of her element. Eliza was standing less than 10 feet away. She heard the soft dismissal, the patronizing, "We're getting her up to speed," as if she were an intern struggling with the coffee machine. Julian was standing right next to Eleanor. He had heard it. She watched his profile, waiting for him to step in, to defend her, to say, "That's enough, Eleanor." Even a fractional shift in his posture would have been something. He took a sip of his wine. He smiled. He said nothing. His silence was a confession. Eliza set down her glass. She walked past the auction tables, past the jazz trio, past a server offering artisanal canapes. She found a quiet terrace overlooking the Puget Sound. She stepped into the cold night air and closed the glass door behind her. Her hands were shaking, not from shame, but from a cold, clear rage. It rose in her like an algorithm executing, clean and logical. It wasn't the kind of rage that shatters things. It was the kind that builds them, only to tear them down with perfect precision. She pressed her palms together. "I am not a feature," she whispered into the darkness. "I am the architect." She stayed there for 5 minutes, breathing, making a plan. Then she straightened her dress and walked back into the party. By the bar, a man approached her, older, with a quiet authority and a watch that cost more than her first car. Marcus Thorne, the legendary venture capitalist who had given Julian his seed funding. "The man of the hour is lucky to have you," Marcus said, his eyes analytical. "You keep him grounded." He smiled. "Forgive me, your maiden name was Hayes, wasn't it? As in Hayes McConnell Analytics?" "It's a fairly common name," Eliza replied, her voice perfectly even. Her posture was relaxed, but a firewall went up behind her eyes. Marcus was a man who'd made billions by seeing things others missed. Something in her calm denial piqued his interest. "Enjoy the evening," he said, but as he walked away, he pulled out his phone. Eliza watched him go. She felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a year. Not fear, not even anger. It was anticipation. The feeling you get right before you launch a new product, when the whole world is holding its breath. She returned to Julian's side. He wrapped his arm around her waist. It felt like an acquisition, not an embrace. That night, driving home, Julian sat in the back seat answering texts. His face was lit by the phone's glow, and he was smiling. "Serafina Vance just texted," he said, his voice bright. "She loved the scallop dish, said it was genius. We're having lunch next week, Eleanor and I. to discuss a new project. Eliza stared at the rain-streaked windshield. Julian kept driving. The silence in the car was a vacuum. "What kind of project?" Eliza asked. "A new concept," Julian said from the back. "Something more intimate. Good branding." But he was still smiling at his phone, a secret, private smile. Eliza saw it in the reflection of the window, and in that moment, she saw the entire blueprint of his betrayal. The house was silent when Eliza got back from her doctor's appointment the next day. Too silent, the kind of silence that means something has been removed. Her appointment had been tense, her blood pressure was high. Dr. Evans had looked at her over her glasses. "Are you getting enough rest?" she'd asked. Eliza had wanted to laugh. Rest. Such a simple concept. Just the usual third trimester stress, she'd said. Dr. Evans's gaze was knowing. "Listen to your body, Eliza. Your body is telling you something." She drove home replaying those words. Her body was telling her something. So was the knot in her stomach where a sense of home used to be. She pulled into the garage and saw Eleanor's car parked in the guest spot. The electric motor was silent, but a faint warmth radiated from the hood. She had been here for a while. Eliza walked inside, dropped her keys on the counter, and went upstairs. She wanted to see the nursery. She had been thinking about the mural on the drive home, a sprawling coastline with orcas and evergreen trees. Her one act of creation in this house. She pushed open the door. The mural was gone. The wall was a cold, sterile gray, the kind you see in professional kitchens. The smell of fresh paint was sharp and chemical. The crib they had picked out in a small coastal town was gone. The mobile of hand-carved birds her father had made was gone. The changing table, the bookshelf filled with stories, the small plush sea otter her sister had sent from California, all gone. In their place stood a long stainless steel prep table, a set of wire shelves, and a vacuum sealer. It wasn't a nursery. It was a test kitchen. A minimalist armchair, fresh orchids in a stark white vase. The space had been completely overhauled into a sterile guest room, Isabel's guest room. Elara stood frozen in the entry, her hands falling limp at her sides. "Where is the nursery?" she asked. She hadn't realized she'd spoken until the sound of her own voice echoed in the quiet, "Oh, you're home." Isabel materialized behind her, fluffing a cashmere throw on the chaise with the meticulous care of a person who believed decor was a moral imperative. "The attic has more than enough room for baby supplies. I had the design team in this afternoon. Newborns don't require much stimulation." Julian agreed, but Julian agreed, Elara repeated. He thought it was practical. He thought it was practical to have our son's nursery dismantled. While I was at my ultrasound, Isabel finally turned Elara. "I didn't get rid of anything important. It was just a white room with some trinkets, 40 vintage music box chimes sourced from 10 different countries. Over 6 months, each one hand-tuned to play a note from a lullaby she had composed a melody for a son she hadn't yet met. Some trinkets." Elara turned and walked towards Julian's home studio. He was sketching at his drafting table. She stood silently in the doorway until he finally looked up. "You let your mother erase our son's room." He leaned back on his stool. She was trying to be helpful. I don't care what she was trying to be. "I'm asking what you did, Elara. She's being oversensitive right now." The word hung in the air like a poison, overly sensitive, the universal excuse to disregard any emotion a pregnant woman expresses that inconveniences a man. "I composed that music myself." Elara said her voice was low and controlled, but underneath a current of something raw was building a tension that had been tightening for months. 40 separate chimes. "I sourced every single one. We can just buy a mobile." Julian said, "That is not the point." "Then, what is the point?" Elara stared at him for 5 seconds, 10. He didn't flinch. He didn't see it. He genuinely did not see why a woman would grieve a room she had poured her soul into for the child growing inside of her. "The point," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "is that you always choose her. You choose her every time without a second thought. Without even the basic decency of faking a moment's hesitation." Julian sighed a deep, exasperated sound. You're turning a few design changes into a catastrophe. A catastrophe. The nursery is a catastrophe. Rooms can be redesigned. Ilara, my mother is staying with us for a while. The baby won't know the difference. I will know. She turned and walked out down the hall, past the brutalist sculpture that she wanted to shatter against the wall, up the narrow staircase to the attic door, and into the stuffy air filled with the smell of old wood and forgotten things. The disassembled crib was there, propped against a beam like discarded furniture. Her box of chimes sat on the floor. The tiny brass gears and silver wires were tangled into a hopeless knot of metal, and broken promises. Ilara sank onto the dusty floorboards, 8 months pregnant, in the attic of a $6 million Boston brownstone. She picked up the knot of chimes and began to separate them one from another, gently, patiently, the way you handle something when it's the only thing keeping you from shattering completely, chime by. Chime wire by wire, her grandmother built a $90 billion logistics empire. Her grandmother commanded boardrooms filled with shipping magnates and finance ministers. Her grandmother had been profiled in The Economist 3 times, and Ilara was sitting on an attic floor fighting for a nursery. She freed the last tiny chime and held the cluster of wires up. The weak light from the single bulb caught the brass and silver, making them gleam in the stagnant air. No more, she whispered finality in the single word, not for the baby, not for Julian, for herself, no more. Her secure phone vibrated. Anya Sterling just made a soft inquiry to our head of security. Anya's voice was pure, lawyer tense and clipped. He was asking about a Julian Croft. I put him off, but Ilara, your alias is starting to wear thin. Ilara looked at the gleaming chimes. She thought about aliases, about disguises, about the quiet, simple woman she had pretended to be for 3 years. Maybe it's time it wore through, she said. The snap didn't come with a bang. It came with a quiet click. 2 days after the nursery was erased, Ilara was in the guest room on a secure call with Anya. The door was closed but unlocked. She was finalizing a port acquisition strategy routine, work the kind she did in stolen hours when the house thought she was resting. She didn't hear the approach. What are you hiding? Isabel was standing in the doorway, her arms folded, her gaze locked on the encrypted tablet in Ilara's hand. She had caught a phrase, a name. Scylla Global. Ilara terminated the connection. I was on a private call. Isabel, I heard you mention Scylla Global. What is that? Some shipping company? Are you involved in something behind Julian's back? It's a personal matter. Isabel stepped fully into the room. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is that it? Are you dragging my son down with you because I warned him? I told him to do a full background check, but he said you were sweet. He said you were unassuming. Unassuming. Another word, another cut. I knew no woman just appears out of thin air with no family to speak of. Isabel continued, her voice gaining the righteous fury of someone who has rehearsed this speech in her head for months. And now I find you whispering about some freight company. What are you, Ilara? What are you really? Ilara rose slowly. She stood a full head taller than Isabel. She had forgotten that she had been making herself smaller for so long. I am your son's wife. She said, I am carrying your grandson, and you are in my room uninvited, demanding I account for myself. Your room. Isabel's laugh was a sharp, ugly bark. This is Julian's house. Our house. You brought nothing to it. The words were calculated, designed to wound. Every syllable was a stone in the prison Isabel had been building around her since the day they met. You trapped my son with this baby, Isabel said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. I see you so clearly, a nobody from nowhere who got lucky. The air in the room grew thick and still. Ilara heard a footstep. Julian was in the doorway. He looked from his wife to his mother. Isabel had tears welling in her eyes, a masterful, perfectly timed performance. What did you do to my mother? Julian demanded. Ilara just stared at him, asked her what she did to me. She's crying. Ilara, she called me a nobody. She said I trapped you. Julian glanced at Isabel, who was dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief she'd produced from a pocket. I was simply expressing my concern, model. It was about the phone call, about the secrets, she said, her voice shaking. Mom, it's fine, Arthur insisted, wrapping an arm around his mother, Evelyn. He then glared at Chloe. She's 70 years old. Have a little decency. Decency? Chloe stopped, pressing her lips into a thin line. She could feel a hot flush climbing her neck, the baby inside her turning over, as if sensing the surge of adrenaline flooding her system. She remembered her doctor's words, "Asterisk, your body is sending you a signal." "I'm leaving," Chloe announced. "Oh, wonderful," Arthur sighed. "The grand departure. I am getting my things and I am going to a hotel. I will let you know when I am prepared to have a conversation that doesn't involve your mother." "That's absurd." "What's absurd is that I'm 34 weeks pregnant and I don't feel respected in my own house." That word stopped him. Asterisk respected asterisk. It wasn't a legal term, but it held its own kind of power. For a brief second, something shifted in his eyes. Was it worry or was it fear? Not for her, she realized, but for how this looked. Chloe packed a single carry-on, clothes, her laptop, the prenatal vitamins, and her personal phone, which she tucked into an outside pocket. She walked down the stairs, past Evelyn, past Arthur, past the cloying scent of potpourri, past the kitchen she once adored, and out the front door. Nobody came after her. She drove for 20 minutes to the Langham, checking into room 1204. A corner suite with a view of the river. The room smelled of fresh linen and absolutely nothing else. No potpourri, no Evelyn, no suffocating disappointment. She curled up on the chaise lounge, pulling her knees to her chest, the position you find when you need to be held, but there's no one around to do it. 2 hours later, her phone vibrated. Arthur's name lit up the screen. Asterisk. Are you finished with this little fit? A fit. She was nearly 9 months pregnant, curled up alone in a hotel room because his mother had called her background unfortunate, and he was calling it a fit. She didn't reply. She placed the phone on the end table, screen down. The lights of the city glittered through the window, hazy and beautiful in the way things are when you're too exhausted to see them clearly. She ordered a bowl of macaroni and cheese from room service. It came with a tiny silver spoon. She ate it sitting on the floor, watching a show about antique hunters on mute. 2 men were haggling over a tarnished silver locket. She almost smiled at how normal it all was. The food, the television, the quiet. It felt like taking a deep breath after being held underwater for a year. At 10:30, she did something she hadn't done in nearly 2 years. She called her father. It rang once, twice. Sebastian Thorne answered on the 3rd ring, his voice crisp and awake, as if he had been expecting her call. "Chloe, girl." Just 2 words, but her own voice broke on the reply. "Dad?" A silence followed, the kind a parent instinctively knows how to interpret. A silence that perfectly measures the weight of their child's sorrow. "Start from the beginning," Sebastian said. So she did. She told him everything. The constant remarks, the arguments over the nursery, the charity gala, the condescending comments about her family, the word provincial, the word emotional. Sebastian listened without interruption. 2 years of carefully constructed distance melted away in 15 minutes of raw honesty. When Chloe finished, her father spoke with the calm finality he used in his boardrooms right after a decision had been made that would reshape a market. "I have allowed you to build your own life, Chloe. I respected that. I respected your choices, even when I profoundly disagreed with them. But if that man and his mother are jeopardizing the health of my grandchild, I will no longer remain a silent party. Am I clear?" Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. She had spent a decade escaping her father's world, the influence, the power, the way Sebastian could bankrupt a rival with a single phone call. But right now, on the floor of a hotel room, pregnant and utterly alone, she didn't hear a titan of industry. She heard her dad. "I understand," Chloe whispered. "I just wanted to be enough for him," she said into the silence. "But I was always in a contest with a woman who had a 35-year lead." "You were never in a contest," Sebastian said, his voice firm. "You were auditioning, and the audition is over." Chloe drew the plush hotel robe tighter around her shoulders. The baby gave a soft kick, a gentle nudge, like a little hand on her arm saying, "I'm still here, asterisk." I'm here too, Chloe whispered back, not sure if she was talking to the baby or to herself. Perhaps it was to both. Meanwhile, Liam Sterling hadn't been sleeping. The name Thorne had been stuck in his head for days. It was a name that felt important, but he couldn't place it. He sat in his office at 6 in the morning, the city still dark, and typed 2 words into the search bar: Thorne Enterprises. The results flooded the screen. He scanned the first few links, then a few more. He leaned back in his leather chair and whispered a word his own mother would have washed his mouth out with soap for using. $50 billion. Global logistics and shipping, founded by Sebastian Thorne, ranked number 7 on the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. And on the board of directors, Chloe M. Thorne, Arthur's quiet wife, the one with the modest upbringing. The woman Evelyn had once described as sweet but terribly plain. Liam shut his laptop. He opened it again. Then he picked up his phone and called Arthur. "Breakfast," he said. "My office, 30 minutes. They sat in his private conference room. Liam had coffee. Arthur had a green smoothie. Liam almost told him he was going to want something stronger. "How's Chloe?" Liam asked. "She's fine, staying at a hotel. You know, pregnancy hormones are making her a bit dramatic." "Right, and her family?" "What about them?" Arthur asked, picking at a croissant. "What is it they do?" "Her father. He's retired, ran some small import-export business in Ohio, I think. She rarely talks about them, nothing notable." Liam placed his mug down on the coaster with practiced slowness, the way you do when your hands are trying to tremble. "Arthur, have you ever actually Googled your wife?" "What?" "Her maiden name, Thorne. Have you ever just looked it up?" Arthur gave a confident chuckle, the kind of laugh a man has when he's sure he's the smartest person in the room. "Why on earth would I Google my own wife?" "Humor me," Liam said. "What is this really about?" "Just do it." Arthur sighed and pulled out his phone. He typed in the name. He waited. His expression began to change, not suddenly, but in slow, agonizing stages, like watching a photograph fade in the sun. First came the furrow of confusion, then a flicker of disbelief, and then the sickening, sinking realization that the world he was standing on was not solid ground at all. This has to be a mistake." "It's not," Liam said. "I had my people verify it. Your wife is the only child of Sebastian Thorne. She sits on the board of a corporation that is worth more than this entire city block, including you and me." Arthur just stared at his phone, the half-eaten croissant forgotten. His face was a slideshow of emotions: shock, denial, fear, a flash of anger, and then more fear, shame. And finally, the one emotion that defined him, the one Chloe had always known was lurking beneath the surface: calculation. His first thought wasn't, "I have been a terrible husband." His first thought wasn't, "I need to go to her and beg for forgiveness." His first thought, visible in the slight tightening of his jaw and the way his eyes went distant, was, "How can I salvage this so I don't lose access to that kind of power?" "Don't even think about it," Liam said softly. "Whatever equation you're running in your head right now, delete it. I'm not calculating." "Yes, you are. And let me tell you, as someone who has played this game for 40 years, you're completely out of your league. You aren't just playing against a grandmaster, you're playing a different game entirely." Arthur left the office without another word. He sat in his car in the parking garage, engine off, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He stayed there for almost an hour, replaying everything. Every condescending thing his mother had ever said. Every time he had failed to defend his wife. The nursery, the gala, the word hormonal, the word fit. The prenup he had insisted on. He had married the heiress to a $50 billion fortune. She had hidden it from him because she wanted to be loved for herself. And he had failed that test so spectacularly that the failure itself was almost a work of art. He called Chloe, no answer. He called again and again and again. Each unanswered ring felt like a stone being laid in the wall he had built between them. Across town, Chloe was on a video call with 6 other people. She was reviewing the security logistics for a new shipping lane through the South China Sea. Operations in 42 countries. Revenue was up 12%. She was poised, clear, and authoritative. The people on the call called her Miss Thorne. They listened intently when she spoke. They took detailed notes. No one dared to interrupt her. When the call concluded, she closed her laptop, looked down at her pregnant belly, and said in a voice that was a world away from the one she used in boardrooms, "Your sister is going to burn his entire world to the ground." The text flashed at 9 that evening, Anya Thorne. Her sister, 5'5", raven hair, and a stare that looked like it had never known fear and was aiming to keep it that way. She strode into the Brooklyn apartment, looked around, looked at Chloe on the sofa with her swollen feet propped on cushions. "This is where you have been hiding." She said it was a statement, not a question. "It is just for a bit, Anya. You have been building a life with a man who does not deserve to proofread your blueprints, let alone share your bed. Our father said something similar. Dad is right. Dad is always right. Do not ever tell him. I said that." She perched on the arm of the sofa for a second. She was not the cutthroat journalist. She was her older sister, the one who taught her how to draft perspectives, the one who got a senior suspended for stealing her design portfolio. "Chloe, I love you, and I respect your choices, but this is not a choice. This is a retreat. And the woman I know does not retreat. I loved him." Anya, past tense. Chloe did not meet her gaze. The silence that followed was its own answer. "I made my world smaller to fit into his," she whispered. "I just did not realize his was a shoebox." Anya reached over and squeezed her knee. She did not offer platitude sometimes. With Anya, that was all you needed. That same night, Isabella was at Julian's penthouse. She had been rearranging Chloe's carefully chosen furniture, looking for flaws. Flaws in what she was not certain, but condescension was Isabella's first language, and she was a master orator on a tablet left on the kitchen island. She found a shared design app, Chloe's account. It was open, and a notification popped up, a private inspiration board named Nursery for Leo. Isabella smirked. She did not understand what she was feeling, jealousy perhaps, or just victory. She assumed it was some pathetic domestic project. A silly hobby Chloe had picked up. She showed it to Julian. He was on the balcony staring at his phone. He had been staring at it for hours. "Your wife is playing decorator," Isabella laughed. She held up the tablet, a baby's room. "Can you believe it? So quaint." Julian glanced at the tablet. He glanced at Isabella. For the first time in their year-long affair, he saw her for what she was, the casual cruelty she passed off as wit, the ambition she called passion, the emptiness of her world, and the mirrors she used to make it seem full. But he said nothing because saying something would mean admitting he had been wrong. And Julian Vance had never, in 38 years, been wrong. The tablet in Isabella's hand lit up a new message on the shared board from Anya Thorne. "Chloe legal consult, finished, no prenup. His primary development project is leveraged to the hilt. Also, 3 of his biggest investors are golfing buddies with Dad thought you should know." Isabella read the text. Her perfectly made-up face went chalk white. The morning after the tablet's revelation, Julian Vance woke at 4:30. He had not slept. He had lain in his custom bed in his $5 million penthouse and stared at the ceiling where a crack had recently appeared in the plaster below. Everything was connected. He just had not seen it. He showered, put on his best suit, the navy one he wore for zoning board hearings. He checked his reflection. He looked like a man who owned the city. He had never felt more like a trespasser. He drove to Anya Thorne's apartment building in Brooklyn. He did not have the address. He found it through a shared university alumni network. He sat in the lobby and called Chloe. She answered this time. "I know," he said. "You know what, Julian, about Isabella, about the penthouse, about all of it." A beat of silence, 3 seconds. "Then how your tablet, he researched you." Another pause longer. "I need to see you," he said. "I am in Anya's lobby. I will be right down." She appeared 5 minutes later. She was wearing a simple black dress and flat shoes, no jewelry, no makeup. Her hair was in a severe bun. She looked like the architect he had first met, the version of herself he had asked her to soften. But something was different. She stood with a new kind of stillness, the certainty of someone who has finalized a blueprint and no longer needs to debate it. Chloe, his voice wavered. Babe, I had no idea. Why did you not say anything? We could have, what we could have been a team. Built an empire. I would have treated you. She let the sentence dangle in the air, waited for him to walk into the trap, watched him realize what he was saying differently. She said it for him. You would have treated me differently. That is not. No, that is precisely what you mean. If you had known I had hired a private investigator, you would have been more careful. You just admitted it yourself and Julian. That is the entire problem. He raked a hand through his hair, the anxious habit, the one he used when an investor was pulling out. I gave you 6 years. Chloe said, her voice was level boardroom level. I gave you every opportunity to love the woman who was building a life with you, not the one you thought you could control. You failed, Chloe, not because you had a mistress, but because you did not think our marriage was worth protecting. Because when your friends called me your pretty little hobby, you laughed when Isabella redecorated our living room. You said it was an improvement. When I told you I felt erased, you told me I was being hormonal. My mistress, she is difficult, but she means, well, your mistress threw out the rocking chair my grandfather made for our son, and you called it decluttering. She called me a sentimental fool. She told you to protect your image from my melodrama, and you let her every single time you let her. Julian's eyes were glistening, but Chloe had learned to differentiate between the tears of a man in pain and a man in trouble. These were the latter. He was not crying because he was sorry he was crying, because he was caught. The lobby doors swished open. Isabella, she had followed him. She stormed in, wearing a leather jacket, and raged Julian. What are you doing here? We need a strategy. She stopped, saw Chloe. Her lip curled. We need to go home, Julian. She said, this little drama is over, Julian. Chloe said, just his name, a quiet warning. I will not be spoken to. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened. A man stepped out, 6'1", silver at the temples, tailored suit, quiet authority. He looked like a scholar. He moved like a predator. Marcus Thorne walked into the lobby. Anya was 2 steps behind him. The lobby suddenly felt like a deposition. Marcus looked at Isabella directly, the kind of quiet gaze that most people found utterly unnerving. You must be the woman who called my daughter's family heirloom clutter. Marcus said. Isabella's mouth flapped open, then shut. She looked like a guppy who had just been introduced to a shark. We were just redecorating, Isabella sputtered. She did not lie. Marcus said she simply made a home. There is a difference. I raised my daughter to believe a person's foundation should be built on integrity, not on shifting sands. You have proven why she was right to trust her own judgment. Isabella looked at Julian, waiting for him to step in to protect her, to be her man. Julian stood between his mistress and his wife, between the woman who had fed his ego for a year and the woman he had betrayed for 6. He said nothing. The silence stretched for 12 seconds. Chloe counted an old habit from her drafting days. Marcus took his daughter's arm. Shall we go home? He said softly, as if they were leaving a tedious gallery opening and not the wreckage of a marriage. Chloe looked at Julian one final time. She searched his face for remorse, for understanding, for the slightest sign that he grasped not what he was losing, but what he had thrown away. She found something small hidden, a flicker of the man who sat with her on a bench in Central Park and asked her to design their future. But a flicker is not a blueprint. A flicker cannot hold a roof up, and she was done seeking shelter in buildings that were condemned. Goodbye, Julian, she said. She walked out of the lobby into the city air. November again, a full circle. The last leaves were clinging to the branches, gold and bronze and the deep bruised purple of dusk. Anya held the car door. She eased herself in carefully. 7 months of baby and a lifetime of baggage. She was finally setting it down as the car pulled away. Her father's phone rang. Marcus Thorne. She did not answer. Anya did. Yes. Anya said, I am Miss Thorne's sister and representing counsel. What is this about a pause on the other end? Then Julian's lawyer said something Anya would later describe as the sound of a man realizing he had just been served with a lawsuit, written on stone tablets, 3 of Mr. Vance's primary investors. Sterling Innovations is reviewing all active partnerships, and our board is requesting immediate liquidation of your outstanding capital investment. Dominic's voice on the phone was crisp, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who had waited 3 years for this exact moment. "Thank you, Dom," Elena said. "We'll handle the rest from here." She looked out the panoramic window of her new apartment, not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of release. Below, the lights of Chicago glittered against the dark water of Lake Michigan. Her father, Lorenzo, reached over and took her hand. He said nothing, he just held it. "You know," Elena said softly, "I spent so long running from all of this." "I know," Lorenzo squeezed her hand, "but you weren't running from us." 6 weeks later, the baby arrived. Elena had settled into a historic graystone in Lincoln Park. Dominic found it for her, 4 bedrooms, a walled garden, and original oak floors that groaned when you walked, which Elena cherished. It meant she could always hear someone coming. Dominic lived 4 blocks away. Lorenzo had leased the entire penthouse floor of the building next door, claiming it was a temporary corporate residence, which in Lorenzo's world meant he was moving in permanently, but would maintain the fiction to respect her sense of independence. The nursery was the first room Elena finished. She painted the mural herself, the Chicago skyline rendered in soft blues and grays, with 42 different architectural marvels hidden in the details. The same passion, the same artistic hand, but on better walls. She painted the Willis Tower above the crib, the Art Institute by the window, and the Monadnock building near the door. It took her 3 full weekends. No one interfered. No one painted over her work. No one suggested the room needed different lighting. The divorce papers landed on a Wednesday. It was clean, quiet, with 0 media leaks. Dominic's legal team had built the case with the surgical precision of a group that had been preparing for this day for 3 years. Arthur contested. His attorney, Henderson, called Dominic to negotiate. The call lasted less than 12 minutes. "My client is ready to discuss a fair distribution of assets," Henderson began. "Your client's assets total $60 million, most of which were funded by venture capital firms that are subsidiaries of my client's family," Dominic replied. "My client controls a $60 billion industrial empire through irrevocable trusts established long before this marriage. There is nothing to distribute." A heavy silence followed. "The penthouse," Henderson ventured, "is in your client's name. He can keep it, along with that ridiculous espresso machine." "What about—" Dominic cut him off. "Let me be very clear. Your client married a Romano and spent 3 years letting his mother mock her career and re-gift her birthday presents. There isn't a single outcome here where he wins. The only variable is how much dignity he retains when he accepts that." Arthur accepted it, though not with dignity. His business collapsed in phases. The severance of capital ties triggered covenant breaches in his loans. 2 major software launches were indefinitely delayed. His primary investor pulled out after learning the personal details, not the financial ones, the other ones. Apparently, allowing your mother to belittle your pregnant wife wasn't a character trait that inspired long-term confidence. He lost the penthouse 2 months later, not to Elena, but to the bank. His net worth cratered from $60 million to 15, then to 7. Eleanor called Elena once. The conversation lasted 45 seconds. "I feel I should apologize," Eleanor said, her tone rigid. It was the apology of someone forced to make a call, not someone who felt remorse. "For what, specifically?" Elena asked. "For any confusion that may have arisen." "There was no confusion, Eleanor. You knew exactly who I was. You just decided I wasn't important enough. I didn't realize your background. That's precisely my point. You knew I was your son's wife, and you thought that wasn't enough." Silence. "I hope you find peace," Elena said. She meant it, not with warmth or malice, but with the dispassionate finality of someone who had moved past hurt into a place of calm certainty. She ended the call, placed the phone down, and looked at the nursery. The city skyline on the wall, the crib waiting, the mobile of tiny architectural landmarks catching the morning sun. The baby came on a Tuesday, October 1st. The first crisp autumn wind blew in from the lake, making the world feel sharp and new. Elena's water broke at 2 in the morning. Dominic drove her to the hospital. Lorenzo was there when they arrived. Marcus, their head of security, showed up 10 minutes later and began pacing the hallway like a man who had never felt anxiety before and was deeply offended by the experience. Dr. Albright delivered the baby at 6:47 a.m. A boy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He had a full head of dark hair and gray eyes that would later turn a deep brown. "He's absolutely perfect," Dr. Albright announced. Elena held her son, feeling the real, warm, substantial weight of him. A life filled with promise and all the beautiful buildings she had ever sketched. "Leo," Elena whispered. "His name is Leo." "For my grandfather." Lorenzo wept. He hadn't cried in over a decade. He stood by the window, letting the tears stream down his face, silent and profound. Dominic held Leo for about 20 seconds before handing him back, his own hands unsteady. "He's so small," he said, his voice thick. "Why is he so tiny? He's 7 pounds, Dom. That's a healthy weight. He should be bigger. He should have a security detail." "He doesn't need a security detail," Elena said, smiling. "He has us." Arthur requested to be there for the birth. Elena refused. He met his son 2 days later under supervision. Dominic was there, not as a lawyer, but as a brother. Arthur sat awkwardly in a chair by the hospital bed. Elena placed Leo in his arms. He held him the way one holds something priceless and fragile, with a dawning horror that he was touching something real. He cried, not for Elena, not for their marriage, and not for his lost fortune. For the very first time, Arthur Sterling cried because he truly understood what he had lost. It wasn't a billionaire's daughter or access to an empire. It was this: the warm weight of his own son, the peaceful trust in his sleeping face, and the woman across from him who would have adored him for a lifetime if he had only chosen her. "He has your eyes," Arthur murmured, his voice cracking. "He has his own eyes," Elena replied. A week later, the unexpected occurred. Isabella Vance called. Elena nearly ignored the call. She recognized the name. The woman Eleanor had paraded around as Arthur's next chapter. "Mrs. Sterling, Miss Romano," Isabella corrected herself. "I know this is incredibly awkward. I almost didn't call. What can I do for you, Isabella? I needed you to know something. Eleanor pursued me. She systematically positioned me to replace you. She described your marriage as if it were a corporate merger she was planning to dissolve. She gave me Arthur's private schedule. I understand, and now she's telling everyone that you were deceptive, that you hid your family's identity to ensnare him. I didn't think that was right. I wanted you to hear it from someone who was there." Elena was silent for a long moment. She was on the sofa in the living room, and Leo was asleep on her chest, his tiny, even breaths a gentle rhythm against her skin. "Thank you, Isabella. For what it's worth, I read about your new startup. It's brilliant," Elena laughed, a genuine, surprised sound born from the unexpected decency of a stranger. "Thank you," she said again. After she hung up, she sat with Leo for a long time. The Greystone was peaceful. Autumn leaves drifted past the window. The old radiator hissed and ticked. Dominic was bringing over dinner later. Lorenzo was upstairs on a video call with his team in Milan. The world outside was enormous and messy, filled with people making choices, some good, some awful, some that would shadow them forever. Elena looked down at her son. Leo's tiny hand was wrapped tightly around her finger. Fierce, unyielding. "I will never, ever make myself smaller for anyone again," Elena whispered to him, "and neither will you." 1 year later, Elena Romano was on the cover of Forbes, not for the divorce, not for Arthur Sterling, and not for the sensational story of a hidden heiress. Dominic's legal team had crushed that narrative with cease and desist letters that moved with the speed of light. The cover story was about Romano Futures, the new technology and infrastructure division of Romano Industries. It had just completed its largest acquisition ever, a green tech firm with projects on 4 continents. The deal had taken 3 years to close, and Elena had personally led the final stage of negotiations. The photo showed her in a boardroom, wearing a sharp navy blazer and a simple silk blouse. She looked straight into the camera, her expression not smiling, not severe, but perfectly and completely present. The headline made no mention of her personal life. It was a Thursday in October. 1 year since the discovery on the tablet. 1 year since the quiet drive to her brother's apartment. 1 year since the phone call to her father that had changed her entire world. Elena sat in her office on the 51st floor of the Romano Tower. The view swept across the Chicago River all the way to the horizon. The setting sun cast a golden glow over everything. In a corner of the office was a play area. Leo was inside it, happily chewing on a soft block shaped like the Sears Tower. Above him hung a mobile made of tiny, polished steel models of Chicago's most famous bridges. She had built it herself, piece by piece. She had kept it not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof that even the most broken things could be beautifully reconstructed. Her desk was immaculate: a laptop, a cup of coffee, a stack of engineering reports, and a small framed crayon drawing from Dominic's daughter that said, "World's Best Aunt." Her phone vibrated. A text from Arthur. He sent one every month, always polite, always restrained, and always about Leo. "How is he? Did he like the book I sent? Can I see him on Sunday?" Elena replied only when the questions were about their son, never about them. The them that once was had become a rendering. She had archived and moved on from she typed a text. Leo loved the blocks he tried to eat. The red one's Sunday works. For a visit, Dad will coordinate. She put the phone down and looked at Leo. The baby was standing now, holding the edge of his playpen, swaying, but upright. His dark blue eyes were fixed on a mobile of the Chicago skyline. "You like that?" Chloe said. Leo babbled something that was nearly a word. He reached for the Willis Tower, his tiny fingers grabbing at nothing. "You will get there," Chloe said. "Not tomorrow, but you will." The intercom on her desk buzzed. Her assistant, Miss Thorne, "Your father's online." "One perfect." She picked up Dad. "I saw the article." Rosalind said, "You look determined. I look exhausted." "That is the same thing when you are building an empire." Chloe smiled. "How is the Tokyo project on schedule? How is my grandson currently trying to dismantle a stuffed bear, a fine boy testing the structural integrity of his world?" They talked for 12 minutes about concrete tensile strengths. "I think we'll name you Stella." They hadn't discussed Arthur. They had stopped discussing Arthur months ago, not because the topic was too painful, but because it had become irrelevant. After the call, Chloe walked to the massive window. 42nd floor. The city spread out below her, a web of light and traffic and millions of stories. She was wearing leggings and a soft cashmere sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. A cup of herbal tea sat on her desk. She was the same woman Arthur had met at a fundraiser in Boston. She had always been this woman, all versions of her. The one who loved old movies, the one who could command a boardroom, the one who cried at sad commercials, the one who could analyze a global supply chain on a spreadsheet. She was all of them. She had just stopped pretending she was only the parts he was comfortable with. She thought of Arthur not with anger or even sadness, but with the profound and quiet clarity that follows a hurricane when the sky is washed clean and you can see all the way to the horizon. He wasn't a monster. He was simply a man who'd never been forced to be strong, raised inside a world his mother, Genevieve, had meticulously crafted to be seamless and small, demanding no resilience. Arthur chose ease at every turn, not from a place of cruelty, but because he was utterly unaware that another path existed. That, however, was his story to live, not hers to fix. She thought of Genevieve, a woman so terrified of her son leaving her orbit that she systematically poisoned every relationship he ever formed. A woman who valued people based on their utility and discarded them the moment they became inconvenient. A woman who had looked at Eleanor's growing belly and called the baby a complication. Eleanor didn't despise Genevieve. She saw her clearly, which was somehow more painful. Understanding someone who wounds you robs you of the comfort of calling them a villain. You have to face the fact that they were just human, flawed, terrified, and causing immense damage with the same hands they probably used to soothe their own children. And then she thought of herself, the woman who made herself invisible, who quieted her own voice, who measured her breaths instead of speaking her mind, the woman who stayed in guest wings and renovated basements and cold hotel suites because she believed love demanded you carve pieces of yourself away. That woman wasn't dead. She was a part of Eleanor's history, and she always would be, but she wasn't driving anymore. Aurora pushed herself up in the playpen, her tiny legs trembling as she stood. She took a single wobbly step, then another, before her diapered bottom met the floor with a soft thump. She looked up at her mother, her face a mask of utter astonishment. Eleanor laughed and knelt beside the enclosure. "That was 2, she whispered. "That was 2 whole steps." Aurora's tiny hands reached for the geometric mobile above her, the polished brass shapes still just beyond her grasp, but closer than they were yesterday. "Come here," Eleanor said. She lifted her daughter from the playpen, settling the familiar weight on her hip, and walked to the window. The sun was bleeding below the Boston skyline, painting the clouds in shades of fiery orange and deep violet, with that impossible, fleeting blue that lasts only for a few moments between dusk and true night. The city began to glitter. "You see all that?" Eleanor murmured, her voice close to her daughter's ear. "That's the world. It is vast and noisy, and sometimes it won't be fair. People will try to put you in a box. They will see your name and make assumptions. They will look at you and see only what they want to see." Aurora tangled a fist in her mother's hair. "But you are an abbot, and abbot women build their own damn houses." She kissed her daughter's forehead, inhaling the clean, sweet smell of baby lotion and new beginnings. The mobile in her apartment's nursery would be catching the city lights tonight, casting shadows on the walls, a collection of shapes inspired by the great female architects. Zaha for boldness, Eileen for integrity, Julia for vision, and Aurora, the brightest light of all, the one who wasn't just a design on a wall, but a warm, breathing soul in her arms. Eleanor turned from the window, placed Aurora back in the playpen, and sat at her drafting table. She flipped open her laptop. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But first, she reached for her mug of coffee and took a sip. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Cold coffee, a worn paperback on design theory, and the profound satisfaction of a woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to exist. She had spent 3 years in a Beacon Hill mansion where she was an afterthought, where her would-be nursery was dismantled without her consent. Her name was a footnote. Her pregnancy was deemed a delicate condition. Her legitimate feelings were brushed off as hormones, and her escape was labeled a hysterical fit. For 3 years, she'd believed that to be loved, she had to be less. She knew better now. The door to that prison had been open all along. She'd been her own jailer, choosing comfort over conviction, silence over self-respect, choosing to be agreeable because it was safe, and safe meant avoiding pain, and a painless life was a life unlived. No more. She glanced at the magazine on her desk. Her own face stared back from the cover of Architectural Digest, not smiling or posing, just present, solid, permanent, unapologetic. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Clara. "Dinner at my place tonight. Bring champagne, the good kind." Clara's reply came in 4 seconds. "On my way. I bought 2 bottles, because I'm a realist." Eleanor smiled, putting the phone down. She looked out the window one last time. The city was coming alive, building by building, light by light, 1,000 small brilliances pushing back against the encroaching darkness. She was one of them now. She walked into her home office not because it was the only space left, but because it had the best view in the entire apartment, and she was done with small rooms. Closing disclaimer: this story was thoughtfully crafted, developed, and manually edited by our creative team to provide our audience with empowering narratives that reflect real-life challenges and offer emotional resonance.